Well, Derek Sloan, leadership candidate. As you know, freedom of expression is a vitally important issue. 63% of the viewers of the BC debate, which I directed, voted free speech as the most important issue. In fact, out of the 42 ridings, a majority of them requested free speech as a topic, and it was discussed. But I really wanted to speak to each one of you and get a deeper understanding of your platform on this, because clearly there's a huge demand for it. So, to start off, why do you feel that free speech is so prominent at the moment?
Well, I think we're seeing more and more the cancel culture that's rampant, not just on university campuses, although it is rampant there, but elsewhere. And I was pleasantly surprised, but not truly surprised, to see that being the number one issue in terms of response on my campaign. Any issue dealing with freedoms, and I've done webinars with free speech as a subject. I've done webinars with freedom of religion as a subject. Anything dealing with freedom, those webinars have just been jam-packed. And freedom is clearly an issue that's resonating with conservatives. And I've said several times, we need to make our election strategy based on freedom, not on, boutique tax credits, but on, structural values like freedom.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more. In terms of what we do at UBC and nationally, the Free Speech Club deals with young individuals who care about freedom. They may not necessarily be conservative, but a lot of younger folks who volunteered during the election, they weren't motivated around tax cuts or taking the GST off of the home heating. It's just not. It's not really inspiring when you compare it to freedom of expression. Your slogan is conservative without apology, which I think speaks a lot to the issues in the conservative movement. Do you feel, that there is a splinter in conservatism in terms of people who see free speech as an issue and say, that's too controversial, and people like yourself who are willing to tackle it head on?
Yeah, I think there's certainly a difference between a faction of the party that believes we need to go along to get along, and another faction which believes that we have to stand on our principles. I don't think any conservative would say free speech is unimportant, and probably every conservative would consider that free speech is under attack. But we actively have to address these issues, and it means dealing with controversy. I mean, no one who's getting canceled or banned on university campuses is the reason they're getting banned is because they're not towing the politically correct line in some way. And so, we as conservatives have to be confident enough to say, free speech is a value where even if I don't necessarily agree with what someone else is saying, I have to. I mean, we used to say things, or some people used to say things like, I may not agree with what you have to say, but I will die to protect your right to say it. I mean, I don't think anybody says things like that anymore, and nobody really stands strong on free speech. Very few people, and even fewer in politics.
Interesting. So, free speech isn't indefinitely vital to society. I think we both agree on that. How do we balance the criticisms that we're going to receive, that I receive a lot, and no doubt you probably do, from our opposition, which is, oh, well, you support free speech, that's just a hidden hate speech. You want to promote hate speech. How do we articulate to the voter and to the membership and to the general public that we're not promoting anything hateful? We're just promoting freedom of expression.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that's actually the very trick that the left is used to weaponize political discourse and hate speech laws generally. And basically their move is to define anything that runs counter to their political aspirations, their political goals, as hate speech. Now, it's true, for example, that the courts have not weaponized the concept to the same degree as the left would like them to. But the fact that, we have these laws means that, and as, these left-wing activists, which I went to law school with, as they start to populate the bench, we're going to start seeing a movement towards basically the politicization of speech. And we're already seeing that in cancel culture, but we're going to see this movement where if you say the wrong thing, the wrong think of George Orwell, you're going to be penalized for it. And to quote George Orwell again, he said, "If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear." And as simple as that concept may seem, we're not seeing that on our university campuses today. We're seeing, if you say something I don't like, well, that's because you hate such and such a group, and therefore you need to be silenced. So the weaponization of free speech is very troubling, or the weaponization of speech, I should say, the weaponization of these laws that try and curtail. I believe personally that the protections that we have in law for for speech are sufficient. I mean, we have laws against spreading falsehoods. Libel and slander, right? We have laws against threatening others. We have laws against coaxing others to commit a crime. I mean, we have all kinds of laws that deal with creating situations that might actually cause, physical damage or other damage to people. And to me, the construct of hate speech is created in such a way that it can be used politically to silence political dissent on the other side. And to me, in a free society, that should be troubling to anybody.
Yeah, it does seem to be a bit of a foot in the door technique to tug away at your heartstrings on issues that are very nuanced. It all comes down to, well, what do we do about it? On our end, we're actually taking UBC to the Supreme Court because they've now moved to just cancel our events that are controversial in their eyes or that Antifa want to protest. But on a larger scale, I think a lot of people are curious about policy. And I think you stand out there. I think you're very, very vocal about that. So I'd love to hear, your pitch. What do you got? Let's say you're prime minister tomorrow. What do you do? What do you do about this issue, which is a cultural issue, but clearly there's a lot of legalities to it. What do you do about it?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things here. And of course, we have the overall cultural issue, which is something that isn't changed overnight. But we do have, and another issue as well is that there's a lot of provincial human rights laws and commissions that seem to impact free speech as well. So the first thing is that the government can take a decidedly pro-free speech stand. So if someone is having court issues over speech, the government can intervene. They can have the Attorney General intervene on behalf of that person. When it comes to federal funding for universities, we can make that contingent on robust protections for free speech. And I believe I was the first candidate in this race to make an issue of that particular funding issue. We also need to look at we need to look at laws in the federal jurisdiction that impact free speech. So hate speech laws are one, and I know that that's controversial to talk about. But we need to have a real discussion on the utility of them. I've also highlighted Bill C-16, which is a bill that Jordan Peterson testified against in the Senate, became famous in part. His initial movie was in part about this Bill C-16. We live in a big country where there's all kinds of people, and I have nothing against transgender people or any other type of person. But to a bill like C-16, which inculcates certain ideologies into the human rights system, and basically, if you don't agree with or if you don't necessarily understand or even know certain pronouns, and someone says you have to say it, I mean, it's a big imposition on somebody, and I don't think that any law should force another person to say anything. So Bill C-16 is an issue that I've taken on head on. I think that we need to repeal Bill C-16. Another issue that I've championed or spoken about is the issue with social media and the banning and the shadow banning and the deplatforming. And I think that we need to take that on. And I think you may ask me about that later, so I can go into that more later.
Yeah.
But we need to take on this banning, because the social media companies, they're basically just doing whatever they want, and we're seeing some very troubling political biases. I'll quickly say one more thing on the free speech. And sorry, I'm going on here, but
No, absolutely.
I was just speaking to a couple of young conservatives here in Montreal, and as you're probably aware, being a young conservative in Montreal is kind of like being a young conservative at UBC. There's not a lot of you, and you stick out like a sore thumb. So these people over here, they are getting what's known as being doxxed, where someone is saying where you live or where your kids go to school. These people here are being actively doxxed by Antifa and other types of groups just for being conservative. And, I think that we need to have criminal laws against doxing in this country because it's a form of threatening people into silence. And doxing is illegal in some other jurisdictions, but we need to have criminal sanctions against that, especially when people are doing it with a malicious intent. So that's another issue that I'm in favor of.
Yeah, well, I know all about doxing. Well, as you know, I mean, it's you get a lot of people who want to silence you by posting where you live, posting pictures of your loved ones. There's a lot of malicious people out there, so I certainly sympathize with those young conservatives. One of the policies I was very curious about is the policy related to social media, which essentially, what you're arguing is to essentially make it illegal for a social media like Facebook or Twitter to ban someone unless they committed a crime or something like that. Could you explain that a bit more on how that would work out?
Yeah, I'd love to do that. So, we have an issue, and Donald Trump has actually spoken a little bit about this as well. But we have an issue where our social media platforms, they claim to be neutral platforms, and they're exempted from things like libel and defamation because they're not a publisher like a newspaper. They claim to be a neutral platform, but at the same time, they're actively, so far as we can tell, and there's some good evidence that this is so, they're actively politically censoring people on Facebook for political views or even deeply held moral convictions. And there was a great interview done by Rebel News on this issue. They had a guy that was actually hired by Facebook during the 2019 election. And his group was actively deleting thousands of posts that were critical of Jagmeet Singh, that were talking about, being critical of the open border situation. And, to me, that is serious. I mean, Facebook is viewed as sort of a medium for exchanging information. And a lot of people, for better or worse, get their information on social media. And to think, I mean, we're, on one hand, the left is talking about Russia or whoever it is they think is putting false information. And yet they're enabling Facebook from censoring real information. I mean, real Canadians are sharing their opinion about Jagmeet Singh or the border, and they're erasing it like it never existed. And I think that's very troubling. So what I've said is that platforms, if they want to maintain this protection as a neutral platform, they will need to either A, have a very clear code of conduct. So if you want to say something like you can't use the F word or something, that's fine. I mean, you can express a political opinion without using the F word if that's what Facebook wants to do. But if they have a more generic code of conduct, like we want a welcoming atmosphere and no hate speech and no this, it could be construed. I mean, I don't understand how a criticism of Jagmeet Singh, in all honesty, contradicts Facebook's code of conduct. So whether the code of conduct is appropriate or not, Facebook and these other organizations, it's a wild west. They're free to do whatever they want when it comes to banning and even shadow banning people. YouTube will demonetize somebody who's making their entire living online just because they don't like them. I mean, to me, that's wrong. That's discriminatory. And if a social media company wants to do business in Canada, if they want to be free from, liability for these types of things, they won't be able to ban someone for their political views. So their ability to ban will be based off of either a very straightforward code of conduct, or if someone's breaking a law of Canada. So if they're threatening somebody, if they're doxing somebody, if they're, inciting violence, if they're, inciting terrorism. I mean, these are things that, of course, we shouldn't be giving a platform for. But if they are expressing an opinion about the open borders, expressing an opinion about the NDP, these are expressing opinion about a moral conviction, about whatever, abortion or the status of marriage. I mean, these are things that people have opinions on, and they should be free to express them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think in many ways, 2016, the election in the United States set a certain precedent when it came to freedom of information, where you now have these major companies worried that they can't control information, they can't control people's freedom to actually spread information, that now they're banning and shadow banning. And trust me, in terms of demonetization on YouTube, I'm well aware. And of course, the other side will use our own argument against us and say, well, hey, they're a private company, you're all for the free market, go and make your own version of Facebook or your own Twitter. And there is Parler and different, news, different social media sites, but no doubt something as big as Facebook and Twitter are at this point a publisher, right? So I think that's really fascinating. I just wanted to ask you one more topic on your policy. So Bill C-16, you touched on this before, obviously very prominent, very controversial as a bill. It made Jordan Peterson very famous. What is the precedent specifically on Bill C-16 that is troubling to you?
Well, the implication that Jordan Peterson brought up is the idea that provincial human rights courts have interpreted similar provisions in such a way that not using the correct pronoun in an area that's covered by the code would constitute discrimination. And that was the basic argument that Jordan Peterson brought forward. Now, thankfully, and maybe somebody can prove me wrong, I don't know of anybody who has gone to jail for not using the correct the pronoun that's been asked of them. So, I mean, that's good. But I don't think it changes the original argument that people like Jordan Peterson, one of my old professors at the University, Bruce Party, these people were bringing this forward at the Senate, and they were showing how not using a designated pronoun that you were asked to could be constituted as discrimination. It could be followed up with a fine or some sort of a re-education component, and if you were to refuse to do that, you could be called in contempt of court and eventually thrown in jail. So that was the line of reasoning that the different lawyers were using. So, I think that concern is real. I've heard, for example, there's a particular case that the details are not privy to the public, but there's a particular case in BC of a father whose daughter was transitioning and he didn't want her to. And there's been a publication ban, I believe, on the details of that case. But as I understand it, Bill C-16 was used as kind of a law that was spoken of or used as a precedent in this particular case. So I believe that this law is having far-reaching implications, and we don't necessarily know all of them. But I believe the original concerns that Jordan Peterson and others raised are valid.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I wanted to ask you, I find it interesting that we have a similar history in terms of our university career with Jordan Peterson. You mentioned in the BC debate that you were part of a group that invited Jordan Peterson to campus. I myself, with the Free Speech Club, have invited him numerous times. So I wanted to ask you, do you feel as though this culture war that has occurred on campuses, I'm sure it's occurred in your own academic career, which involved Jordan Peterson, do you feel as though that has really shaped you as a conservative?
Yeah, so I mean, I was certainly I was certainly a conservative before I brought Jordan Peterson to campus, and I wouldn't necessarily call myself a Jordan Peterson conservative, but I do think, and by that I don't mean I dislike him. I just mean I don't feel like I'm Jordan Peterson Jr. or anything like that. But I think that the case of Jordan Peterson shows the broad, the potential for outreach the Conservative Party has to a broad coalition, because Jordan Peterson basically reached out to a broad and diverse group of people who are concerned about cancel culture and censorship and other things. And, the party best able to capitalize on that sort of outrage is the Conservative Party. And another interesting thing is that Jordan Peterson made his hay, so to speak, on what really would be called a social conservative issue if it wouldn't have been him that brought it up. So, anything to do with transgender rights or being against a bill that's relating to transgender rights would typically be considered a social conservative issue. And it's very interesting to me on the intersection of sort of social conservatism and then also the pragmatic sort of libertarianism of somebody like Jordan Peterson. And, often traditionally libertarians have felt different than social conservatives, but it's funny that the nexus of libertarian ideas right now is really focusing on, the transgenderism and the compelled speech in this area. So I think it's a way to tie a lot of loose ends together in our party. And, I believe that, the fact that Jordan Peterson is so popular with youth, it should be evidence to us that we have to make liberty and free speech a bedrock of not only our party, but our campaign strategy. And, I will say when we invited Jordan Peterson to Queens, I went out to eat with him afterwards, and I was having a conversation with him across the table for about 3 hours. And we didn't speak about gender or anything. We spoke about Jordan Peterson is one of the most fascinating people you'll ever meet, and he has ideas on his time as a working with honeybees to his ideas for cleaning plastic out of the ocean. I mean, the man has ideas on absolutely everything, and he's a fascinating person, and he's a great example of someone with intelligence and creativity and courage, and what a human being can do if they don't confine themselves to the politically correct strictures that society tries to put on us. So he's a great person, and I look forward to meeting him again. He was somewhat famous, but not world famous when I had him there, and I, of course, was a mere student and not a politician. So I hope our paths cross again, and I wish him all the best.
Yeah, well, as someone who has also had dinner with Dr. Peterson, I can attest to the fact that the dinner is very long and it's him talking 90% of the time. It's quite an experience, especially after he's already spoken for 2.5 hours at the event. I don't know where he finds the energy, but I certainly wish him well. And I agree with you. I think this goes back to what we were discussing before, which was that young people aren't going to get very motivated by, we're going to take the GST off of home heating or something like that. We need something inspiring. And, when I look at your campaign and when I look at the fact that this is being talked about, to me, the free speech issue isn't even a SoCon issue or libertarian issue. It's a freedom issue. And to me, it is a winning issue. If you speak to your average, hockey mom and dad, and you explain everything that's going on to them and articulate it to them, they'll agree with you. But I think the other side has just done such an effective job of pushing the Overton window. It's sort of, and it's also that people aren't public about it. It's sort of like a dinner table transparency is how I think about it, where at dinner, when it's in private, everyone's honest with you and says, here's what I think, but I'm too afraid to say it in public. So I like you, I've pushed this idea to the party multiple times that, look, this is actually an issue that I believe is a winning issue. So I'm really glad to see that you agree. I asked Erin a similar question on this. I know you're a father, and this really matters to you. Your kids are going to go to university one day, and I assume you don't want them to be indoctrinated. So, what message of motivation or hope do you give to a young conservative on campus right now? A young conservative who feels like, what, I don't have a place here. I have to retreat and just focus on myself and the culture is lost. What could you say to motivate them?
Well, I think that our movement is winning. And I think that, social media, for example, we're seeing an explosion of, varieties of opinions and independent journalism. And yeah, Facebook's trying to ban them and YouTube is demonetizing them. But the Facebooks and YouTubes are losing on that front. People can find out anything on the internet in a matter of minutes that before they would have to use a newspaper to find out. And there's it's a great day for humanity that we have the internet and other things like this. I think that our movement is reaching a tipping point. I think there's a lot of different people who are coalescing behind this new, it's kind of a new conservatism in the sense that it's very grassroots oriented. It's very freedom oriented. I believe it's a true conservatism. And I meet people every day that say, hey, like, I've never been in politics before, but like, I think I'm conservative and I really like what you're saying. And I believe there's a lot of people out there like that. And I would just say, keep your head high. Doing what you're doing is great over there. And I would just say, keep hope to these people. And I think we're winning. And it may look grim, but I think that the grassroots movement is coalescing behind us. And I think we're about to see some big changes.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, I know you're a busy man, so I thank you for coming on and talking about free speech. It's, again, a highly, highly requested topic. So I wish you nothing but luck in the race. I know it's sort of go time. It's home stretch right now. So I thank you for making time. I know it's late over there, but thank you again. Thank you.
Well, thank you for all the work you're doing, and I appreciate you having me on this evening.
All right.